Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating, the colonial blueprints of modern corruption and the explosive, often overlooked history of the African women who boldly stood up and resisted it. We're going to see how systems of power were fundamentally re-engineered in the past and how those very same designs are still impacting public office today.
You know, we hear it all the time, right? A politician gets caught taking bribes or embezzling funds, and we immediately think, wow, what a greedy person. We chalk it up to a moral failure. But if you look closely at history, especially across the African continent, it reveals something wild. What if corruption isn't just individual greed? What if it's actually a structural design flaw, a flaw that was intentionally imported and installed during colonialism? To really wrap our heads around how that works, we have to look at how things functioned before.
Section 1. The Roots of Modern Corruption. Let's travel back in time for a second to pre-colonial Igbo land in southeastern Nigeria. We need to see how power was managed before European arrival completely upended everything. There is a stark, totally wild contrast between these two ways of managing society. The pre-colonial Igbo system was described by scholars as ultra-democratic. We're talking massive community consensus. Decisions weren't just handed down by a single ruler, they were hashed out through long discussions among elders, men, and women. The checks and balances were so rock solid that a leader who lost the people's trust could literally be removed. But then, you contrast that with the system the British imposed. It was entirely top-down, highly centralized, completely unaccountable to the local population, and frankly, designed specifically just to extract resources.
That brings us to Section 2, the rise of warrant chiefs. To enforce this new, highly extractive system, the British brought in a completely foreign administrative setup. They knew they didn't have the manpower to rule directly, so they fundamentally altered the socio-political landscape by creating a brand new class of leaders, the warrant chief. So what is a warrant chief? Well, it's a leader created completely without community input, handpicked by colonizers. Their entire authority came from a literal piece of paper, a warrant. And here is the crucial part. They were accountable only to the British officers. They ruled entirely above the local community, totally insulated from those traditional checks and balances that used to keep leaders honest.
It's honestly a step-by-step masterclass in how structural corruption is born. First, these chiefs are handpicked. Sometimes they were literal social misfits elevated just because they were willing to obey British orders. Second, with all this unchecked power, they start extorting the local community. Third, alongside court messengers known as kotima, they begin selling justice in the new colonial courts to whoever could pay the highest bribe. And finally, they take all that illicit wealth and build lavish, zinc-roofed houses to physically elevate themselves above the very people they're robbing. Public office literally transformed from community service into a get-rich-quick scheme.
Which leads us right into Section 3, the 1929 Women's War.
Now, local communities didn't just sit back and watch their societies get dismantled, especially the women. They were bearing the absolute brunt of this oppressive new patriarchal structure, and they refused to take it quietly. In 1929, the colonial administration made a huge mistake. They tried to suddenly count and tax market women's property and livestock. That was the spark. Word spread like wildfire, and soon over 25,000 women across 2 provinces mobilized in an event famously known as the Women's War. This wasn't some tiny, disorganized protest. It was a massive, incredibly well-coordinated uprising that totally shocked the British authorities.
And their tactics were absolutely brilliant. The women weaponized a powerful traditional cultural practice called sitting on a man. Basically, if a man broke community rules, women would gather outside his home. They'd sing, dance, beat on his walls, and publicly shame him until he capitulated. During the Women's War, they literally sat on the corrupt warrant chiefs until these guys either formally resigned on the spot or wrote out guarantees that they wouldn't tax the women. It was an incredibly effective subversion of colonial authority.
Moving on to Section 4, a continent of resistance.
What we see in the Women's War is actually just one piece of a massive puzzle. Women across the entire African continent were coming up with innovative, highly organized ways to subvert these lopsided structures. Just listen to this fierce warning from Algerian women in 1958 during their fight against French colonial rule. These women were smuggling weapons, fighting on the front lines, doing it all. And they issued this profound statement to the men. Basically, if we fight off colonial oppression only to maintain the oppression of women, beware because another revolution is coming, and it's going to be ours. They demanded total structural change.
This spirit of defiance spanned decades and borders. We see Cameroonian women in the 1958 Anlou Rebellion using a shaming tactic, very similar to sitting on a man, to push back against colonial agricultural reforms, literally shutting down markets and mocking administrators for 3 years. Then, fast forward to 1992 in Kenya. Mothers boldly occupying Uhuru Park in Nairobi, launching a hunger strike, and facing down violent police batons to demand the release of political prisoners. Their sheer bravery inspired strikes and riots across the entire city.
And we even see this ancestral power being weaponized in the modern era. In 2012, a massive corporate conglomerate backed by the government tried to grab ancestral land in the Amuru district of Uganda. The local women fought back using a deeply culturally resonant tactic. They stripped naked in front of the surveyors and government reps. In Achawi culture, this is believed to invoke terrifying curses and profound shame upon the offenders. It was so intense, the officials literally fled. But resistance isn't always physical, it's cultural too. Somali women used the rich oral tradition of Barambur poetry to amplify their grievances. They used verse to document their struggles during the anti-colonial movement, and later to boldly call out post-colonial leaders who had taken power and just forgotten the women who helped put them there. They made absolutely sure their voices couldn't be erased from history.
Which brings us to Section 5, the Female Chief Paradox.
Up to now, you might be thinking the battle lines are super clear. Male colonial oppressors on one side, fierce female resistance on the other. But history always throws a curveball, doesn't it? Let me introduce you to a fascinating anomaly, Ugbabe Ahebi. She was the absolute sole female warrant chief under the entire British colonial administration in that region. She even achieved the title of king. But her story isn't some triumphant tale of feminist victory within the system. Actually, it proves that the colonial structure of power was perfectly designed to corrupt, no matter who was sitting in the chair.
Apebi's reign is the ultimate paradox of power. On one hand, she totally shatters binary gender narratives and highlights just how fluid Igbo gender norms actually were before colonial rules set in. But on the other hand, she acted exactly like the male warrant chiefs. She used the very same oppressive, unaccountable colonial structures to exert power over her people. It brilliantly and tragically illustrates that just inserting a woman into an inherently corrupt system doesn't magically fix the system. The structure itself is the disease.
Finally, Section 6, Reclaiming the Community. So, if the design of the system dictates the outcome, how on earth do we fix modern sociopolitical corruption? Well, it requires a massive conceptual shift. We have to dismantle that lingering colonial perception of what public office is. We need to transition away from Orubeke, an Igbo term that emerged during colonialism meaning the white man's work. It essentially became shorthand for viewing public office as an alien entity, a chance to get rich quick and extract from the people without guilt because the agenda was set far away. Instead, we have to move back toward Oru Oha, which translates to community work, genuine stewardship. Leaders who are firmly embedded in the community, trusted by them, and most importantly, can be instantly called to order by them. I'm going to leave you with a final provocative question to chew on. We've seen how colonial structures manufactured a lasting legacy of top-down corruption and how communities, especially women, have continuously fought to hold power accountable. If the actual structures of governance dictate our political realities and our levels of corruption, who holds the real power to set the agenda in your community right now? And what structures might you need to change or even resist to take that power back? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the structures around you.